Margaret Thompson knelt in the rich, dark soil of her front yard, her weathered hands gently placing seedlings into perfectly spaced rows that would soon bloom into a vibrant community garden. The morning sun cast golden light across her modest home on Maple Street, highlighting the careful attention she had given to every square foot of earth that surrounded her property. At 72 years old, Margaret had found purpose and joy in transforming what others saw as ordinary lawn space into something beautiful and productive, creating a living testament to the healing power of nature and the satisfaction that comes from nurturing life from seed to harvest. Hey there, beautiful souls. It's your friend Tina here, and I'm so excited to share another incredible story with you today. This is about Margaret, a woman whose simple love for gardening revealed something extraordinary that none of her neighbors could have imagined. I want you to stay with me until the very end, because what unfolds in Margaret's story will remind you that sometimes the things people judge us for are actually our greatest strengths, and that authentic living has a way of revealing truth in the most unexpected moments. If you believe in the power of staying true to yourself, even when others don't understand, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to become part of our community. Trust me, Margaret's journey will touch your heart in ways you won't see coming. Margaret had moved to the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook 3 years earlier, after her husband Robert passed away and she could no longer maintain their large family home in the countryside. The transition from wide open spaces and endless gardens to a small suburban lot had been difficult, but Margaret was determined to make the best of her new circumstances and find ways to stay connected to the earth that had always been her source of comfort and meaning. Her new neighbors, however, seemed to have very different ideas about what constituted appropriate yard maintenance and community standards in their well-established neighborhood where appearances mattered more than personal fulfillment. From the moment Margaret began tilling the soil in her front yard, replacing the pristine grass lawn with raised beds and carefully planned garden plots, she became the subject of whispered conversations and disapproving looks from neighbors who valued uniformity over creativity and questioned whether her gardening activities were appropriate for their upscale community. The Homeowners Association had specific guidelines about lawn maintenance and exterior appearances, but Margaret's gardens technically fell within the allowable parameters, even though they clearly violated the unspoken expectations of neighbors who preferred the manicured perfection of professional landscaping services over the organic beauty of homegrown vegetables and flowers. Linda Harrison, who lived in the imposing colonial house directly across the street, made no effort to hide her disapproval of Margaret's gardening project and frequently made pointed comments about property values and neighborhood standards whenever she encountered Margaret working in her yard. "I don't understand why she insists on turning her property into some kind of farm," Linda would say to other neighbors during their evening walks, her voice carrying across the street with deliberate volume to ensure Margaret could hear her criticisms. "We moved to this neighborhood for a reason, and that reason wasn't to live next to someone who apparently can't afford proper landscaping or doesn't understand the importance of maintaining community standards that protect everyone's investment in their homes." The criticism stung more than Margaret wanted to admit, but she continued her work with quiet determination, finding solace in the rhythm of planting and weeding and the satisfaction of watching her garden grow, despite the negative attention it attracted from neighbors who seemed more concerned with appearances than with the joy and purpose that gardening brought to her daily life. She had learned over 7 decades that other people's opinions about her choices said more about them than about her, and she wasn't about to abandon something that brought her happiness just because others didn't understand or appreciate the value of what she was creating. David Chen, who owned the modern house on Margaret's left side, was particularly vocal about his concerns regarding the impact of Margaret's gardening on the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal and property values. He worked in real estate and considered himself an expert on the factors that influenced home values and market appeal, often lecturing anyone who would listen about the importance of maintaining uniform standards that would attract the right kind of buyers and preserve the investment that homeowners had made in choosing this particular community. "Look, I understand that gardening is a hobby for some people," he would say during neighborhood barbecues and social gatherings, But there's a time and place for everything, and a front yard in an upscale neighborhood is not the place for growing vegetables and flowers that make the whole street look like some kind of rural farming community. The comments about being poor began subtly at first, with neighbors making assumptions about Margaret's financial situation based on her choice to grow her own food rather than purchasing expensive landscaping services or maintaining the type of elaborate lawn displays that characterized most homes in Willowbrook. They assumed that someone who spent their time gardening and preserving vegetables must be struggling financially and unable to afford the lifestyle that their neighborhood represented, never considering that Margaret's choices might be motivated by values and preferences rather than economic necessity. Margaret continued her work through the changing seasons, creating a garden that not only produced abundant vegetables and beautiful flowers, but also attracted beneficial insects and birds that brought life and natural beauty to a neighborhood that had become sterile and artificial in its pursuit of perfection. She found deep satisfaction in the work itself and in the connections she was rebuilding with the natural world that had always been her greatest source of peace and purpose, even as she dealt with the ongoing criticism and social isolation that her choices had created within the community where she had hoped to find acceptance and belonging. As spring turned to summer, Margaret's garden reached its full glory, creating a vibrant oasis of color and life that stood in stark contrast to the uniform green lawns and carefully manicured shrubs that characterized the rest of Maple Street. Her tomato plants grew tall and strong, heavy with fruit that she would later can and preserve for the winter months ahead, while her flower beds attracted butterflies and bees that brought movement and natural beauty to a neighborhood that had forgotten the simple pleasures of watching nature thrive without human control and artificial enhancement. The irony was not lost on Margaret that her neighbors complained about her garden's appearance while secretly admiring the abundance and vitality that her plants displayed throughout the growing season. The social isolation that resulted from her neighbors' disapproval became more pronounced as the months passed, with Margaret finding herself excluded from neighborhood gatherings and community events where she might have formed friendships and connections with people who shared her love of gardening and sustainable living. Linda Harrison organized monthly book clubs and coffee mornings for the women on the street, but Margaret was never invited to participate, despite her obvious intelligence and the wealth of life experience she could have contributed to their discussions about literature and current events. The exclusion was subtle but deliberate, creating a clear message that Margaret's lifestyle choices had placed her outside the acceptable social circle of neighbors who valued conformity over diversity and material success over personal fulfillment. David Chen's real estate expertise became a frequent topic of conversation whenever neighbors gathered to discuss property values and market trends, with Margaret's garden serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining standards that would protect their investments and preserve the character of their community. "I've seen this kind of thing before," he would tell anyone who expressed concern about the long-term impact of Margaret's gardening activities. "And it always starts with one property owner who thinks the rules don't apply to them. And before you know it, the whole neighborhood starts to decline and property values suffer because buyers don't want to purchase homes in areas that don't maintain consistent standards of excellence and community pride." But Margaret's commitment to her garden went far deeper than her neighbors understood, rooted in decades of experience and knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women in her family who had found strength and purpose in working the land and creating beauty from seeds and soil. Her grandmother had taught her that gardening was about more than producing food or flowers. It was about staying connected to the natural cycles that governed life and finding peace in the simple act of nurturing growth and witnessing the miracle of transformation that occurred when seeds were planted with intention and tended with care. These lessons had sustained Margaret through difficult times in her life, including the recent loss of her husband and the challenging transition to living alone in an unfamiliar community where she struggled to find her place and purpose. The whispered comments about Margaret being poor intensified as neighbors observed her preserving vegetables, hanging herbs to dry, and making her own compost from kitchen scraps and yard waste that others would have simply thrown away or paid someone else to remove. They interpreted these activities as signs of financial hardship rather than environmental consciousness or personal preference, never considering that Margaret might be choosing to live more sustainably because she valued self-sufficiency and wanted to reduce her impact on the environment. The assumptions they made about her economic situation revealed more about their own values and priorities than about Margaret's actual circumstances. But the social pressure and ongoing criticism began to wear on her spirit and make her question whether she had made the right decision in moving to Willowbrook. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next door on Margaret's right side, was the only neighbor who showed any interest in Margaret's gardening efforts, though even her curiosity was tempered by concern about what the other neighbors might think if they saw her expressing too much enthusiasm for activities that had been deemed inappropriate for their community. She would sometimes stand at her kitchen window watching Margaret work, and occasionally she would venture outside to ask questions about specific plants or techniques. But these conversations were always brief and conducted in low voices to avoid attracting attention from other neighbors who might disapprove of any positive interaction with someone who had been essentially ostracized from their social circle. Margaret began to wonder if she had made a mistake in choosing this neighborhood, questioning whether the peace and satisfaction she found in gardening were worth the social isolation and ongoing criticism that her choices had generated among people who seemed more concerned with maintaining appearances than with building genuine community connections. The loneliness was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her situation, as she had hoped that moving to a neighborhood with other people her age might provide opportunities for friendship and mutual support during this new phase of her life, when she was learning to navigate the world without her husband's companionship and shared interests. The summer heat intensified both the growth in Margaret's garden and the tensions with her neighbors, who seemed increasingly frustrated by her refusal to conform to their expectations and abandon the activities that they viewed as inappropriate for someone living in their community. The abundance of her harvest only seemed to reinforce their belief that she was somehow taking advantage of the neighborhood's prestige while failing to contribute to the standards that made it desirable, not understanding that Margaret's contributions were of a different nature entirely, and that her garden was creating beauty and environmental benefits that enhanced the community in ways they couldn't recognize or appreciate. My dear friends, I need to pause here because I can feel how many of you are connecting with Margaret's courage to stay true to herself despite the judgment and isolation she's facing. If this story is touching your heart like it's touching mine, please take a moment to subscribe and become part of our family here. I want you to know that your authentic self matters, and there's so much more to Margaret's incredible journey that will show you the power of perseverance and truth. Share in the comments if you've ever felt judged for staying true to your values. Your stories inspire the content I create and remind us all that we're not alone in choosing authenticity over acceptance. The autumn months brought both a bountiful harvest and increased tensions as Margaret prepared her garden for winter, while her neighbors continued their campaign of subtle harassment and social exclusion that had made her daily life increasingly difficult and isolating. She spent her days preserving the fruits and vegetables she had grown with such care, filling her pantry with jars of tomatoes, pickled cucumbers, and dried herbs that would sustain her through the winter months, and remind her of the satisfaction that came from living in harmony with natural cycles rather than depending entirely on commercial food systems that disconnected people from the sources of their nourishment and the rhythms of the earth. Linda Harrison's disapproval had evolved from whispered criticisms to more direct confrontations, with the woman making pointed comments whenever she encountered Margaret working in her yard or carrying baskets of vegetables from her garden to her house. "I suppose some people are satisfied with that kind of lifestyle," Linda would say loudly enough for other neighbors to hear, her voice carrying implications about class and social status that were designed to reinforce Margaret's position as an outsider who didn't belong in their community. But those of us who care about property values and neighborhood standards have to think about the bigger picture and how individual choices affect everyone else's investment in maintaining the kind of community we all moved here to enjoy. The social dynamics of the neighborhood had crystallized around Margaret's presence, with her garden serving as a symbol of everything that the other residents believed threatened their carefully constructed vision of suburban perfection and social status. They had created an informal coalition of disapproval that included most of the homeowners on Maple Street, united by their shared belief that Margaret's activities were inappropriate and potentially damaging to their collective interests in maintaining property values and community standards that would preserve their investments and social standing. David Chen had begun documenting what he called violations of community standards with photographs of Margaret's garden taken from various angles and at different times of day, collecting evidence that he planned to present to the Homeowners Association in an attempt to force her to conform to their expectations or face potential fines and legal action. His real estate background had given him confidence in his ability to identify the factors that influenced property values and market appeal, and he was convinced that Margaret's garden represented a threat to the economic interests of everyone else in the neighborhood who had invested significant amounts of money in their homes and expected those investments to be protected by consistent standards of maintenance and appearance. The campaign against Margaret's gardening activities had taken on a life of its own, with neighbors competing to express the most creative criticisms and demonstrate their commitment to maintaining the standards that they believed distinguished their community from less desirable neighborhoods, where people might be allowed to grow vegetables in their front yards or express individual preferences that deviated from established norms. The peer pressure to participate in the criticism had become so intense that even neighbors who might have been privately sympathetic to Margaret's situation felt compelled to join the chorus of disapproval or risk being ostracized themselves for failing to support the community's collective judgment. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated, not just socially, but emotionally, as the constant criticism and exclusion began to erode her confidence and make her question whether she had the strength to continue fighting for her right to live according to her own values and preferences. The gardening that had once brought her joy and peace now carried the additional burden of defying community expectations and enduring daily reminders that her neighbors viewed her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be welcomed and valued for her unique contributions to their shared environment. Mrs. Patterson's tentative friendship had become one of Margaret's few sources of comfort during this difficult period, though even that relationship was constrained by the older woman's fear of attracting criticism from other neighbors who might interpret her kindness as support for activities they had deemed inappropriate. Their conversations remained brief and carefully neutral, avoiding topics that might be construed as endorsement of Margaret's choices or criticism of the community's response to her presence. But the small gestures of human connection meant more to Margaret than Mrs. Patterson probably realized. The winter preparations that Margaret undertook with such care and attention to detail became another source of criticism from neighbors who interpreted her practical activities as further evidence of her inability or unwillingness to live according to the standards they expected in their community. They watched her cover plants for winter protection, collect seeds for next year's garden, and organize her preserved foods with the same disapproval they had shown for her spring planting and summer harvesting, never recognizing the knowledge and skill that her activities demonstrated or the environmental benefits that her sustainable practices created for their shared neighborhood. The loneliness of the holiday season was particularly difficult for Margaret as she watched her neighbors gathering for parties and celebrations while remaining excluded from the social connections that might have eased her grief over Robert's death and helped her feel more at home in her new community. She spent Thanksgiving alone with her preserved vegetables and homemade meals, grateful for the abundance her garden had provided, but wishing she had someone to share it with who could appreciate the love and care that had gone into creating food from seeds she had planted with her own hands in soil she had nurtured and improved through months of dedicated work. The approaching winter also brought new concerns about the sustainability of her situation, as Margaret began to wonder whether she had the emotional resources to continue fighting for her right to garden while dealing with the ongoing stress of social isolation and community disapproval that seemed to intensify rather than diminish as time passed. The physical demands of gardening were manageable for someone her age, but the psychological pressure of living as an outcast in her own neighborhood was taking a toll that she hadn't anticipated when she first decided to transform her yard into a productive garden that would bring beauty and purpose to her new life in Willowbrook. The first major snowfall of winter brought a temporary ceasefire to the neighborhood tensions. As Margaret's garden lay dormant under a blanket of white, that transformed the contested landscape into something peaceful and neutral that no longer served as a daily reminder of the conflicts that had divided the community throughout the growing season. Margaret found herself with more time for indoor activities and reflection, spending her days planning next year's garden while processing the social dynamics that had made her first year in Willowbrook so challenging and isolating, despite her hopes for finding community and connection in this new phase of her life. During the quiet winter months, Margaret discovered that her reputation had spread beyond Maple Street to other parts of Willowbrook, where people who had heard about the garden controversy were curious to meet the woman who had caused such a stir among the typically conformist residents of one of the town's most prestigious neighborhoods. Some of these people reached out to her with offers of friendship and support, having heard about her situation through the social networks that connected different parts of the community, and recognizing in her story something admirable about the courage required to live authentically despite social pressure and community disapproval. Dr. Sarah Williams, a retired botany professor who lived across town, contacted Margaret after hearing about her gardening expertise from Mrs. Patterson, who had finally overcome her fear of neighbor disapproval enough to speak positively about Margaret's knowledge and skills to people outside their immediate social circle. Dr. Williams had been looking for someone to help with a community garden project at the local library, and she was impressed by Mrs. Patterson's descriptions of Margaret's garden design and the diversity of plants she had successfully grown in what were supposedly challenging soil conditions that required significant expertise to manage effectively. The conversation with Dr. Williams revealed aspects of Margaret's background that would have surprised her critics on Maple Street. Had they taken the time to learn about her life experiences and qualifications before making assumptions about her economic situation and social status? Margaret had earned a degree in environmental science decades earlier, before marriage and family responsibilities had redirected her career path toward teaching elementary school children about nature and conservation through hands-on gardening programs that had won recognition from educational organizations throughout the state where she and Robert had lived before his death brought her to Willowbrook. Her expertise in sustainable agriculture and organic farming methods had been developed through years of study and practical experience managing the large gardens and small farm operation that she and Robert had maintained on their rural property, where they had experimented with companion planting, natural pest control, and soil improvement techniques that had allowed them to produce abundant harvests while enhancing rather than depleting the natural environment. The knowledge that her neighbors dismissed as the desperate activities of someone too poor to afford proper landscaping was actually the result of decades of education and experience in fields that were becoming increasingly important as communities recognized the environmental and health benefits of sustainable living practices. Dr. Williams was delighted to discover that Margaret possessed both the theoretical knowledge and practical skills needed to help design and implement the library's community garden project, which was intended to provide educational opportunities for children and adults while demonstrating sustainable growing techniques that community members could adapt for their own use. The project had been struggling to find direction under the leadership of well-meaning volunteers who lacked the expertise needed to create a successful demonstration garden that would serve its educational mission while producing the kind of results that would inspire others to adopt similar practices in their own gardens and yards. The collaboration with Dr. Williams gave Margaret a sense of purpose and professional respect that she had been missing since moving to Willowbrook, where her neighbors' focus on appearances and social status had prevented them from recognizing or valuing the knowledge and skills that she brought to their community. Working on the library garden project also connected her with a network of environmentally conscious residents who appreciated her expertise and welcomed her contributions to their ongoing efforts to promote sustainable living practices and environmental education throughout the town. As winter progressed toward spring, Margaret began receiving invitations to speak at garden clubs and environmental organizations in nearby communities, where her reputation as an expert in sustainable gardening was spreading through networks of people who valued knowledge and experience over social conformity and material displays of wealth. These speaking opportunities not only provided her with income that supplemented her retirement savings, but also gave her a platform to share the environmental philosophy and practical techniques that had guided her gardening throughout her adult life, and could help others create their own sustainable growing spaces. The contrast between her growing recognition in the broader community and her continued ostracism on Maple Street became increasingly stark as Margaret realized that her neighbors' criticism said more about their own limitations and prejudices than about the value or appropriateness of her gardening activities. The people who invited her to speak at their organizations and sought her advice for their own gardening projects understood that sustainable living practices required knowledge, skill, and commitment that deserved respect rather than criticism. And they appreciated her willingness to share her expertise with others who were trying to live more harmoniously with the natural environment. Margaret's confidence began to return as she realized that the judgment she had faced from her immediate neighbors was not representative of how most people viewed her choices and accomplishments, and that there were many communities where her knowledge and values would be welcomed and appreciated rather than criticized and marginalized. The winter months of reflection and new connections had given her perspective on her situation and renewed her determination to continue gardening according to her own values while finding ways to connect with people who shared her appreciation for sustainable living and environmental stewardship. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the familiar urge to begin planning and preparing for another growing season that would test Margaret's resolve to continue gardening despite the ongoing disapproval of her neighbors, who had spent the winter months plotting new strategies to pressure her into conforming to their expectations for appropriate yard maintenance and community standards. Margaret felt renewed energy and purpose as she began ordering seeds and preparing her soil for another year of growing vegetables and flowers that would bring beauty and abundance to her life, while continuing to challenge the narrow definitions of acceptable suburban living that her neighbors seemed determined to enforce. The winter's networking and speaking engagements had given Margaret connections with suppliers and experts who could help her expand her garden's productivity and educational value, transforming her modest yard into an even more impressive demonstration of sustainable growing techniques that would serve as a living classroom for anyone interested in learning about environmental stewardship and self-sufficient living. Dr. Williams had arranged for the local agricultural extension office to provide soil testing and consultation services that would help Margaret optimize her growing conditions while documenting the improvements her methods had made to soil health and biodiversity in her small but intensively managed garden space. Linda Harrison and David Chen had not been idle during the winter months, using the time to research legal strategies and community organizing techniques that might force Margaret to abandon her gardening activities or face escalating consequences for what they continued to view as violations of community standards that threatened their property values and social status. They had consulted with lawyers specializing in homeowners association law and had begun building a case based on alleged violations of covenants and restrictions that they believed gave them the authority to control how Margaret used her property for activities they deemed inappropriate for their neighborhood. The legal research had revealed that Margaret's gardening activities were technically within the allowable uses specified in the community's governing documents, but Linda and David were confident that they could build a case based on nuisance claims and community standards that would give them leverage to pressure Margaret into compliance with their expectations or face costly legal battles that might force her to choose between her garden and her ability to remain in her home. They had begun documenting what they called negative impacts of Margaret's gardening, including increased insect activity, changes in local wildlife patterns, and what they claimed were unpleasant odors from composting activities that allegedly affected their enjoyment of their own properties. Margaret was unaware of the legal maneuvering taking place around her as she focused on preparing for what she hoped would be her most successful growing season yet. Incorporating lessons learned from her first year in Willowbrook's soil and climate conditions, while implementing suggestions from her new professional network that would help her garden serve as an even more effective demonstration of sustainable living practices. The support and recognition she had received from the broader environmental community had restored her confidence and reinforced her commitment to continuing her gardening activities regardless of local opposition from neighbors who seemed more concerned with appearances than with the environmental and educational benefits her garden provided. The arrival of spring also brought new interest from potential allies within Willowbrook, as word of Margaret's expertise and the controversy surrounding her garden spread through social networks that connected different parts of the community and attracted attention from residents who had been looking for guidance in starting their own sustainable gardening projects. Several younger families had reached out to Margaret for advice about growing vegetables with children, recognizing the educational value of hands-on gardening experiences that could teach environmental awareness and self-sufficiency skills that were becoming increasingly important as communities faced challenges related to climate change and food security. Mrs. Patterson had gradually overcome her fear of neighbor disapproval and had begun openly expressing her admiration for Margaret's knowledge and accomplishments, telling anyone who would listen about the impressive results Margaret had achieved in her first year of gardening and the valuable lessons she had learned from observing Margaret's techniques and philosophy. This vocal support from someone who had lived in the neighborhood for decades and was respected by other long-term residents began to shift the social dynamics slightly, creating space for other neighbors to reconsider their assumptions about Margaret and her gardening activities. The changing social dynamics became more apparent as Margaret began her spring garden preparations, with some neighbors showing subtle signs of curiosity rather than pure disapproval as they observed her methodical approach to soil preparation, companion planting, and natural pest management techniques that demonstrated a level of knowledge and skill that was difficult to dismiss as the desperate activities of someone too poor to afford professional landscaping services. The obvious expertise required to manage such a diverse and productive garden in a relatively small space challenged their assumptions about Margaret's background and qualifications, even if they weren't ready to admit their mistakes publicly. Dr. Williams had arranged for a local television station to film a segment about sustainable gardening at Margaret's property. Recognizing that her garden had become one of the most impressive examples of small-space, intensive growing techniques in the region, and that the controversy surrounding it made for an interesting human interest story about community values and environmental consciousness. The prospect of media attention brought new urgency to Linda and David's efforts to stop Margaret's gardening before their neighborhood became publicly associated with the conflicts they had created through their campaign of harassment and exclusion. Beautiful souls. I need to pause here because Margaret's story is about to reveal something absolutely incredible that will change everything her neighbors thought they knew about her situation. If you're feeling inspired by Margaret's courage to stay true to herself despite the pressure to conform, please take a moment to subscribe and become part of our community here. I'd love to hear in the comments about times when you've had to choose between authenticity and acceptance, or when you've discovered hidden strengths in yourself or others. Your stories create this beautiful space where we can all feel less alone in our journeys toward living truthfully. What happens next in Margaret's story will show you the power of persistence and the surprising ways that truth has of revealing itself when we least expect it. The television crew arrived on a beautiful spring morning when Margaret's garden was beginning to show the first signs of new growth, with seedlings emerging from carefully prepared beds and early flowers adding splashes of color to the landscape that would soon become a showcase of sustainable growing techniques and environmental stewardship. The reporter, Jessica Martinez, had been assigned to cover the story after receiving a tip about the community garden controversy from Dr. Williams, who thought the conflict illustrated important issues about community values, environmental consciousness, and the challenges faced by people trying to live sustainably in suburban environments that prioritized appearances over substance. Margaret felt nervous about the media attention, but recognized the opportunity to share her message about sustainable living with a broader audience, while demonstrating that her gardening activities were based on genuine expertise and environmental principles rather than economic necessity or disregard for community standards. She had prepared talking points about soil health, biodiversity, food security, and the educational value of hands-on gardening experiences, hoping to shift the conversation away from neighborhood conflicts toward the broader environmental benefits that sustainable gardening could provide for communities willing to embrace practices that supported rather than depleted natural systems. Linda Harrison and David Chen watched the television crew's arrival with mounting anxiety, realizing that their campaign against Margaret's gardening was about to receive public scrutiny that might not reflect favorably on their efforts to maintain community standards through social pressure and legal intimidation. They had not anticipated that Margaret's activities would attract positive media attention, or that their neighborhood's treatment of her might become a subject of public interest and potential criticism from viewers who might interpret their actions as harassment rather than legitimate community advocacy. The interview process revealed aspects of Margaret's background and expertise that surprised even the reporter, who had expected to find an elderly hobbyist gardener rather than someone with formal education in environmental science and decades of experience implementing sustainable agriculture practices on both small and large scales. Margaret spoke knowledgeably about soil microbiology, companion planting strategies, integrated pest management, and water conservation techniques that demonstrated a level of expertise that challenged assumptions about why someone might choose to grow their own food and maintain a productive garden rather than hiring professional landscaping services. Jessica Martinez was particularly interested in the community response to Margaret's gardening, conducting interviews with several neighbors who expressed varying levels of criticism and concern about the impact of her activities on property values and neighborhood standards. Linda Harrison spoke passionately about the importance of maintaining uniform community standards that protected everyone's investment in their homes, while David Chen provided detailed explanations of how individual property choices could affect market values and buyer perceptions throughout the neighborhood. Their comments revealed the depth of their opposition to Margaret's gardening and their belief that her activities represented a threat to their economic interests and social status. The contrast between Margaret's environmental expertise and her neighbors' focus on property values and social conformity created a compelling narrative that highlighted broader tensions between individual expression and community standards, environmental consciousness and economic priorities, and authentic living versus the pursuit of status and material success. The reporter recognized that the story had implications beyond the specific conflict on Maple Street, touching on issues that were relevant to communities throughout the region where similar tensions existed between residents with different values and priorities. As the television crew prepared to leave, Jessica Martinez mentioned that she would be conducting additional research about property ownership and community governance issues for a follow-up segment that would air the following week, focusing on the legal and social frameworks that governed conflicts like the one that had divided Margaret's neighborhood. Margaret didn't think much of this comment at the time, assuming it would involve standard research about homeowners association rules and property rights that would provide context for viewers unfamiliar with suburban governance structures and community standards enforcement. The initial news segment aired 3 days later during the station's evening newscast, featuring Margaret's interview alongside comments from her neighbors and footage of her garden that showcased the diversity and productivity she had achieved in her first year of gardening in Willowbrook. The report presented the controversy as a conflict between environmental values and community standards, with Margaret portrayed as an expert gardener whose sustainable practices had attracted both criticism from immediate neighbors and recognition from environmental organizations throughout the region. The public response to the news segment was overwhelmingly supportive of Margaret, with viewers calling the television station to express admiration for her gardening expertise and criticism of her neighbors' treatment of someone who was clearly contributing positively to environmental awareness and sustainable living education. Social media comments praised Margaret's knowledge and dedication while questioning why her neighbors would object to activities that provided environmental benefits and educational opportunities for the broader community. The positive public reaction surprised everyone involved and began to shift the narrative around Margaret's situation from neighborhood controversy to inspiring example of environmental stewardship. Linda Harrison and David Chen were mortified by the public attention and the negative comments their interviews had generated from viewers who interpreted their concerns about property values and community standards as selfishness and intolerance towards someone whose activities were clearly beneficial and educational. They began to realize that their campaign against Margaret's gardening might have backfired by attracting public scrutiny to their behavior and motivations in ways they had not anticipated or prepared for when they began their efforts to pressure her into conforming to their expectations. Margaret found herself receiving calls and messages from people throughout the region who wanted to learn about sustainable gardening techniques, visit her garden for educational purposes, or invite her to speak at their organizations about environmental stewardship and sustainable living practices. The media attention had accelerated her growing reputation as an expert in sustainable gardening and had connected her with an even broader network of people who appreciated her knowledge and shared her values about environmental responsibility and authentic living. Jessica Martinez returned the following week with a camera crew and a story that would transform everything the neighborhood thought they knew about Margaret Thompson and her right to garden on her property. The investigative research that Jessica had conducted for her follow-up segment had uncovered information about property ownership and land history that would shock Margaret's critics and reveal the true extent of her connection to the land they had been trying to force her to abandon. The reporter had spent hours at the county courthouse and land records office, tracing property deeds and ownership documents that told a story far more complex and surprising than anyone could have imagined. Margaret was as surprised as everyone else when Jessica arrived with documents showing that her property ownership extended far beyond the modest lot where her house sat, encompassing nearly 200 acres of land that stretched for miles in every direction around the Willowbrook neighborhood where her critics lived. The revelation that Margaret Thompson was actually the owner of virtually all the land underlying their exclusive community came as a complete shock to neighbors who had spent months criticizing her gardening activities and questioning her right to use her property according to her own preferences and values. The property documents revealed that Margaret's late husband Robert had inherited the land from his family, who had been among the original settlers in the area and had accumulated vast holdings through farming and wise land management over several generations. When developers approached them decades earlier about selling portions of the land for residential development, Robert and Margaret had agreed to sell building lots while retaining ownership of the underlying land through a complex arrangement that allowed them to lease the land to homeowners while maintaining their rights as the ultimate property owners for the entire development. Linda Harrison and David Chen stood in stunned silence as Jessica Martinez explained the legal implications of the land ownership documents. Realizing that the woman they had been harassing and trying to force out of the neighborhood was actually their landlord, with legal authority over land use decisions that extended far beyond her own modest garden plot. The irony was overwhelming. They had spent months criticizing Margaret for allegedly failing to understand community standards and property values, when in reality, she owned the very land their expensive homes were built on, and had every legal right to make decisions about land use throughout the entire development. The lease agreements that homeowners had signed when purchasing their properties included specific provisions about land use and environmental stewardship that actually supported rather than prohibited the type of sustainable gardening activities that Margaret had been pursuing on her own portion of the property. Robert and Margaret had included these provisions decades earlier, because they believed in the importance of maintaining environmental health and sustainable practices throughout any development that occurred on their family land, even as they allowed others to build homes and create their own version of community life. Dr. Williams, who had been working with Margaret on the library garden project, was delighted by the revelation, but not entirely surprised, having suspected from Margaret's extensive knowledge and confidence in her land management decisions that there might be more to her background and connection to the area than had been publicly known. The environmental science degree and decades of farming experience that Margaret possessed had been applied not just to her own gardening activities, but to the careful stewardship of hundreds of acres that her family had managed for generations before agreeing to share portions of it with other families seeking to build homes in the beautiful natural setting that the Thompson family had preserved and protected. Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as she watched her neighbors struggle to process the revelation that their months of criticism and social exclusion had been directed towards someone who had every legal and moral right to make land use decisions throughout their community. She had never intended to keep her property ownership secret, but she had assumed that information would be readily available to anyone interested enough to research property records before making assumptions about her background and rights as a landowner. The fact that none of her critics had taken the time to understand the legal framework governing their community before launching their campaign against her gardening activities spoke volumes about their approach to problem-solving and conflict resolution. The legal implications of Margaret's land ownership extended beyond simple property rights to include environmental stewardship responsibilities that she and Robert had taken seriously throughout their decades of managing the land for sustainable use and conservation purposes. The lease agreements that governed the homeowner's rights to use the land included specific provisions about maintaining environmental health and supporting biodiversity that actually aligned perfectly with Margaret's gardening practices and made her activities not just permissible, but beneficial for fulfilling the conservation commitments that were part of the original development agreement. Linda Harrison and David Chen found themselves in the uncomfortable position of realizing that their legal threats and homeowners association complaints had been directed towards someone who possessed far more authority over community land use decisions than they had understood, and whose environmental expertise and conservation commitments had been protecting property values and environmental quality throughout the area for decades before they arrived as newcomers to purchase homes on land that the Thompson family had carefully stewarded for generations. The revelation transformed Margaret's social standing in the community overnight, as neighbors who had been critical of her gardening suddenly found themselves approaching her with apologies and requests for advice about how they might incorporate more sustainable practices into their own property management, while honoring the environmental commitments that were actually part of their legal obligations as lessees of Thompson family land. The shift from criticism to consultation happened so rapidly that Margaret sometimes felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention and requests for guidance from people who had been avoiding and excluding her just days earlier. Mrs. Patterson was among the first to apologize sincerely for her failure to support Margaret more strongly during the months of community criticism, acknowledging that her fear of social disapproval had prevented her from standing up for someone whose knowledge and dedication deserved respect rather than harassment. The friendship that had been constrained by social pressure blossomed into a genuine partnership, as Mrs. Patterson became one of Margaret's most enthusiastic supporters and advocates for expanding sustainable gardening practices throughout the neighborhood. Dr. Williams worked with Margaret to develop educational programs that would help community members understand both their environmental responsibilities as lessees of the Thompson land and the practical techniques they could use to fulfill those commitments while enhancing their own enjoyment of their properties. The programs became so popular that they attracted participants from other communities throughout the region, establishing Margaret's property as a demonstration site for sustainable suburban living that drew visitors and students from environmental organizations, schools, and other neighborhoods interested in learning about conservation practices. The transformation of community attitudes toward Margaret's gardening created opportunities for collaborative projects that brought neighbors together around shared environmental goals rather than dividing them through conflicts over appearances and social status. Several families began converting portions of their lawns to native plant gardens and vegetable plots, working with Margaret to design sustainable landscapes that would support local wildlife while producing food and beauty for their households. The sense of community that emerged around these collaborative efforts was stronger and more meaningful than the artificial unity that had been based on conformity to arbitrary standards of appearance and material display. Margaret's story became a powerful example of how assumptions and prejudices could blind communities to the value and expertise that existed among their members, and how taking the time to understand rather than judge could transform conflicts into opportunities for learning and growth. The media coverage of her situation attracted attention from environmental organizations, educational institutions, and community development specialists who recognized the broader implications of her experience for building more sustainable and inclusive communities that valued knowledge and environmental stewardship over social conformity and material competition. The resolution of the neighborhood conflict allowed Margaret to expand her gardening activities and educational programs while building the kind of community connections she had hoped to find when she moved to Willowbrook. Her expertise in sustainable living became a valuable resource for neighbors who were learning to see their properties not just as investments to be protected, but as opportunities to contribute to environmental health and community resilience through practices that supported, rather than depleted, the natural systems that sustained their shared environment. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. The woman her neighbors had criticized for being poor and inappropriately focused on gardening had turned out to be the landowner whose family's wealth and environmental stewardship had made their exclusive community possible in the first place. Margaret's choice to live simply and focus on sustainable practices reflected values and priorities that had nothing to do with economic necessity and everything to do with environmental responsibility and authentic living that honored the land's capacity to support healthy communities for generations to come. As spring progressed into summer, Margaret's garden became a gathering place for neighbors who were learning to appreciate both the practical knowledge she shared and the philosophical approach to living that had guided her family's relationship with the land for generations. The transformation from social outcast to respected community leader happened naturally as people recognized that Margaret's expertise and values represented exactly the kind of wisdom and leadership their community needed to thrive in harmony with the natural environment that sustained them all.